good morning to the Caron YouTube audience, and again, a good morning to those of you who are with me and those who might be watching on live stream. And I'm grateful to be here. Those of you who are used to hearing me and watching on YouTube, I have a bit of a scratchy throat this morning, but otherwise I'm feeling well enough to just steamroll through. So I ask you to hang in there with me spiritually if you don't mind. I noticed an alignment this week between something I don't usually mention and the chapel theme calendar. So the chapel service has a rotation of, I think, 19 or 20 themes at this point, and we just move through them in sequence. But sometimes they align at different times of the year because it's 20 against 52. And I used to pay attention to the calendar of the Christian churches. It's called the liturgical calendar. And some of you, most wisdom traditions have a calendar. So this year, Hanukkah and Christmas line up pretty tightly. And the liturgical calendar for the Christian community actually began. Its first Sunday was last Sunday, which is the first Sunday of Advent. So today is the second Sunday of Advent. That's a countdown of 4 Sundays getting to Christmas. And it would be typical in the chapel service to underplay that in a large sense. But what I noticed was that some of you may be aware, there's 4 themes for the Advent Sundays. They are in sequence: hope, peace, joy, and love. And the chapel topics put hope on today. So we're within 1 week of each other on the topic of hope. And today's Advent theme is peace. So I think I could push that and say I hope for peace. My sense is that the hope for peace is perennial in humankind, right? That we all have somewhere in us, I hope, a desire for strife to cease. And it's hard to see that in today's environment and landscape. I grieve terribly about so many of the social ills that we face day to day, and the violence that is just so frequent on the morning news. Hope. When I think about hope in this place, or just generally in the journey of my life, I reach back and draw upon experiences that I've had. I draw upon writings that I have come across that have inspired and helped me to understand hope. And I draw upon kind of heroes of hope for me in my life. And that was my thought in speaking with you this morning, is I want to talk a little bit about some experience I've had that relates to how I think about hope, some writings that I draw upon that help me think about hope, and a particular hero in my life that I think about in relation to hope. And then kind of bring it home in terms of making it relevant to today and perhaps to you. So, experience. I feel moved to tell a personal story. I tell a lot of personal stories here, and I think sometimes that can come across as self-indulgent or self-aggrandizing, and I apologize for that. I don't mean it in that way, but I know my story is better than anybody else's. And it's how I kind of try and figure out what I think about things. And it's also a thing that I learned in the 12-step world, is that it's meaningful in recovery for us to speak from our own experience. So the story I'm going to try out and use as an example of hope happened in 2018 and 2019, when it was discovered that I had a possible brain tumor. And it was one of the most weird and arresting moments of my life. Suddenly I was sent from a neurologist to consult with a neurosurgeon, and MRIs, and that's like a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down. And I don't want to get too lost in Jack's medical details, but first of all, it was terrifying. And what had been discovered was that there was they were sure there's a glioma in my right front temporal lobe, way up here, and of decent size, about the size of my thumb. And this is brain tissue gone bad, and it was not yet manifesting in the typical sort of seizures or other sort of, it had been discovered incidentally in research for me on tinnitus, because I have chronic tinnitus now, but the ringing in the ears. So in trying to find out if I could fix my tinnitus, they were like, oh my gosh, this fellow has a glioma in the right front temporal lobe. And then I was like, what? And so One of the things I did at that point, which I guess is now human and natural for most of us to do, I started the very first day I learned the word myeloma, I started searching on Google and reading about it. And then there was, user groups and all that sort of stuff. And the next thing you know, I'm like in the casket. That's right. I just went like, I'm sure I'm dying and I'm going to lose this and that capacity. And I just catastrophic thinking happened within moments. I was sitting in a Starbucks waiting for my brother to come join me for a cup of coffee, and I blasted James with this whole negative future tripping thing. You can see I'm doing really pretty well here. This is now several years later. And pieces of that puzzle that are probably worth adding to the story were, I ended up being very fortunate and ending up with a world-leading neurosurgeon at Columbia in New York City. That was a gift in my life. Great guy, weird, neurosurgeons are weird. But he's explaining all this to me and to my wife, and we're looking at these scans, and we can see this thing, and I'm like, so what do we do about this thing? And he said, well, years ago, they would have biopsied it. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, I want to know what it is. He said, however, Mr. Abel, in order to biopsy it, we have to open your skull, and once I have it open, I'd just rather cut it out. And then he tried to tell me that there was a tremendously high probability that he could take this chunk of my brain out, and that there would be almost no, he said within months you won't even know that it happened. I was like, how sure are you? And he said, well, you might lose movement on your left side for a while, but it'll come back. And once we've taken it out, we can test it in the lab and find out just to what degree it's pernicious. But the last thing we want to do is go in there and take a little chunk of it out and then call you back a week later and say, we need to come back and we're going to reopen your skull and, reset the whole thing. So one of the things I wanted to say also to the Caron audience here as I was telling this story is, I started hearing them say things that I didn't want to hear them say and making recommendations that I did not want to follow. But I could hear myself talking to patients and going, trust the process, dude. Follow direction. So all of a sudden I'm like, ah! And I finally gave up. And I just thought, if I'm going to tell patients day after day that they should follow direction, especially that good direction, one of the things I did is I called a former patient who was a brilliant neurosurgeon. And I told him the whole story, and he wanted to see the scans, and he's like, yeah. And he said, who are you seeing? And I told him who I was seeing. He's like, you're with the perfect person to do this, because the neurosurgeon club is a fairly small club. And this was a guy at Harvard, and telling me that the guy at Columbia was thumbs up. And so I'm like, I have no reason to object and not follow. But I was terrified. And I needed to believe that the outcome would be good. I had reason to believe it might not be. And that's the context in which hope finds its necessity, right? Hope, many of you might be hoping for a certain Christmas present. I'm not talking about that kind of hope, because that's hope within reach, right? You might want to make sure people know what you're hoping for, but, and I don't mean going to see Santa Claus in the mall, but it's real. There are reasons to project, and I was told I had reasons to project good outcomes, but when I read Google, I was like, So anyway, the long and short of it is, I continue to be under surveillance. I get 2 MRIs a year. I did have some post-surgical complications, but I cannot figure out what part of me they took out. That's what some of my great mystery is. How can you take a thumb-sized chunk of my brain out and have me not miss part of who I am? That's bizarre. And I'm grateful today that I had people tell me not only to hope, but to trust in the process and to follow direction. Because if I had not, I would be living with terror every day, waiting for the moment when all of a sudden I would find out that this thing had gotten more pernicious. That's a good word. Okay. That's experience of hope. And I have more. I just talk about hope in my life at different times. But writings. When I think about, many of you know me, I often try to explain, especially to many of our patients, that I began my recovery in 1989 as an avowed atheist. And I struggled a great deal with the recommendations of the 12 steps to find a spirituality that would work for me. But over time, I started realizing that even though I was firm in my conviction of the non-existence of God, especially as formulated in the traditions in which I'd grown up, I really was a spiritually minded person. And one of the places where one of the substitutions I had made was that I relied on this writing, The Lord of the Rings. I don't know how many of you know it or know it well, but J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings functioned in my way as a mythic piece of literature from which I drew insight and wisdom, and I'm a Lord of the Rings nerd. I read it over and over and over again over many years. I was sure Peter Jackson was going to ruin it, but I love the movies. And the extent to which I know the material is embarrassing. But I think it's fair to say that one way of interpreting the Lord of the Rings is as a manifesto on hope. It's a writing about a band of critters, that men and elves and dwarves and hobbits and a wizard that band together to seek to achieve an objective that they have no reason to believe they could achieve. And that's how I felt about recovery. I mean, I thought I could never stop. I thought I could never stay stopped. I was just meeting with a patient this week who told me, oh, well, I can stop for a week or two. I'm jealous of that person. I could not stop. I'm one of these people who was so entrapped in the patterns of my addiction that I had no 24-hour periods in which I found any sort of ability to remain absent. And one of the characters in The Lord of the Rings, I was doing a little research to get ready for today, Legolas, the elf who's part of the Nine that set out to support Frodo in destroying this one ring. Legolas says at one point, "Oft hope is born when all is forlorn." Poetic, right? And old English, but this is the nature of the kind of hope I'm talking about, is when you're reading Google and you think you're going to die, or the narrative around addiction for a long time was like, this is hopeless, and why are we even throwing money at this problem? And people, there's a lot of despair and hopelessness that attends to this. Actually, it turns out inappropriately. People do really well who access decent treatment and throw themselves into the journey. So you can recover. I need to tell you that there is, and those of you who are here because you've been in other treatments before, but are here in what we call our relapse program, I don't like that word, but I would call it recurrence program, like your illness has recurred. That's not necessarily a fatal predictor. Like, people do sometimes struggle to sustain abstinence, and then sustain abstinence very successfully for long periods of time. I have tons of examples of that. So I think about this beautiful story I know of this band of 9 who set out on this adventure, this quest, and at the end of the story, unbelievable things have happened. And I can't skip saying I feel that way about this place, about you, about me, about what happens with addiction. It's like, it looks awful. It looks like, oh my God. And we have terrible outcomes. I mean, I was just speaking with Keith Rogers, our alumni regional coordinator, who's here today with his wonderful wife, Kirsten. Hi, guys. And Keith and I have the responsibility to touch base with a family that had a terrible tragic outcome, but it was from a car accident. It's not substance related. But often Keith and I have to contact families because of suicide and overdose. That's the big risk here. If you want to know what the big negative outcome is, like if I'm a medical practitioner, it's my job to tell you what the big negative outcomes are. The big negative outcomes are suicide and overdose. You have a much higher risk of suicide and overdose if you're wearing the wristband than you did before it was identified that you have a substance use disorder. It's a real possibility, and it's a cause to seek hope. But you've come to this place, we call it Magic Mountain, right? And Magic Mountain is a place where hope is born when all is forlorn. Like, this is a place where hope comes alive again, and where people make the turn and make the move and come back and celebrate anniversaries. And they come back to celebrate anniversaries to make sure that those, because they remember sitting in these seats and thinking, oh, I don't know, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for me. I was sure it was not going to work for me. I was sure I couldn't do a day. I was sure I couldn't do a week. I was sure I couldn't do a month. One of the key moments in my life was in the middle of 2017. They have now all these sort of resources. They have these apps, they have recovery apps. You can find the nearest meeting. You can find all this stuff. And one of the apps that I started, using on occasion was this thing that has, when you open it, has a day counter. So you put in your sobriety date. And when you open it, it tells you how many days, how many months, how many hours, minutes, and all. It's kind of cute. You can over-push the point. But anyway, I started using it, around sometime before 2017. And when I started using it, I had like 8,000 and some days clean. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. I wonder when I'll get to 10,000. So it was in May of 2017 that I had 10,000 days without a drink or drug. That, I'm telling you, was totally not on my radar. And in fact, I just passed 3 years with, I get 2 MRIs a year, but I really don't live in terror about my brain condition. I'm sure I need to be prudent and reasonable about it, but I don't have this underlying dread, thank God. And I was going to run on, but I'm going to try and save my voice and sort of wrap this up. Because, and I had another story, it's a fun story about a man whose wife has cancer, she dies. I watch him go through meetings. He's there through the whole process. We as a community, a home group, supported him. His name is Paul. And what was so powerful for me was not that. It was not watching Paul stay sober through this whole journey of losing his wife. But it was then watching him kind of turtle. He went dark, radio silent for a while. Didn't talk as much in meetings, wasn't as vivacious and vibrant. He was funny and interesting and engaging when I first met him. I remember I moved away from that area to take another church assignment at a certain point, because I'd gone from atheist to pastor. And right before I left that area around Newark, Delaware, which is where this meeting happened, where Paul and I had this intersection, one of the last meetings I went to, Paul came in and he was like, I still need support from y'all, and the reason I need support from you now is I'm terrified. I've got a date. So he'd been married for 30-some years. He lost his wife. He'd been alone for over a year. And now his terror, what he needs support for, was maybe to enlarge the relationship circle of his life once again. So, do not despair. Do not give in to hopelessness. Don't let the nasty voices of those who are around us speak their untruths about the future that they would predict for you. Allow yourself to hold on to the possibility that you, like millions of others, as a family member or as an individual, can experience this extraordinary thing, which is sustained recovery. It can happen for you. It can happen for your family. Sometimes families have to reconfigure around the magic event, and sometimes it takes a great deal of time. I was just conversing with my dear friend Marty Millinder, our chapel music coordinator, about how family has become different for he and I, and for me especially. That's like a complete, family has restructured itself in my life. And now, when I say family, I mean particularly my second wife and our kids, my stepchildren, our grandchildren, who are the centerpiece of what I think about for the future. And that's a different man than would have been in front of you 20 years ago. And when it would have been my family origin, and I would have told less hopeful stories about it. So do not let how you feel about the realities of today be a predictor necessarily for tomorrow. Unbelievable things are possible for tomorrow. There are tomorrows ahead that you probably cannot foresee. And if you try to foresee them and shoot for them, you will undersell what's possible. Follow direction. Allow yourself to have this, even if it seems unreasonable, hope that recovery is alive and awakening in you right now. and that the chaos of the rearview mirror need not be a predictor for that which is immediately ahead. And let us hold on to and celebrate hope for today and tomorrow. Thank you.